Okay, so this is our class about tefillah. And last week we started. Want everybody come closer a little bit? Whatever you want. I don't bite. Okay. So last week we started. I tried to give like a little bit of an overview. How we ended up with tefillot when we started with korbanot, with sacrifices in the Torah, and how did we end up with prayers and that kind of stuff. A little bit of historic background. That what I tried to do last week, and a lot of that material is going to come up as we go through the different prayers. But what I would like to do is, and I know it's kind of a little bit unorthodox, is to actually start with the Shabbat liturgy. Every class that usually deals with tefillah will start with Modeh Ani and that kind of stuff. We'll get there. We'll do that. But the reality is that most people come to shul on Shabbat, and I think it's important that we'll jump right into that stuff, into that material. Many times, by the time classes end up like getting even to the Shabbat material, people are already like lost interest. So with that in mind, we are kind of like, kind of standard Siddur that we're going to use is going to be the Koren Siddur that we have here. The text is going to be pretty much the same. If you have a different Siddur, it's going to be the same. But sometimes I'd like to read the commentary by Rabbi Sachs. And so I kind of like chose the Koren Siddur for our purposes. So we're going to start with page 305, the very beginning of Shabbat. And in the very bottom of the page already, we see Hadlakat Nerot, candle lighting. We're all familiar with that practice of welcoming Shabbat by lighting candles. There are there aren't many differences. I think that everybody has, not everybody, but like I think most people are interested in classes like that. Okay, have the practice of lighting candles on Friday night and also before the Chag. So the blessing itself, Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam. Okay, that's the formula that we find. Hi, Maxine. That's the formula that we find when every time we have a mitzvah, we have the same formula. Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam, asher kiddushanu mitzvotav v'tzivanu. Right? Blessed are you, Lord, our God, King of the universe, who has made us holy through His commandments. Now, it's an interesting formula because what? Because this mitzvah, for example, to light Shabbat candles is not in the Torah. It's not from God. It's actually rabbinic. Right? It's rabbinic. We don't see, you can read the whole Torah from cover to cover. You're not going to find that. So how do we say that God has commanded us to light the Shabbat candle? He did not. Nope. No, we cannot. But that's for a different... yes and no. Let me expand on that in a second, okay? Just give me a second. So the idea here, and that's a formula, and this is the understanding that we're going to see it many, many, many times, is that in spite of the fact that it's not directly from God, it's not written in Torah anywhere, In spite of the fact that it's rabbinic, since the Torah gives the authority to the rabbis, it is as if God himself commanded us. Okay? And that's a principle. We're going to talk about a lot of principles and a lot of a lot of principles. And this is one of those principles, those we call it actually meta-halachic principle. Okay? It's one of those principles that we need to understand that our Judaism today is made mainly of rabbinic rulings. Now, the fact that it is rabbinic rulings doesn't mean that it's not binding. Yes, it's on a different level. That's what, if you heard the term Deoraita versus the Rabbanan, right? Torah versus rabbinic. Okay, so it has like somewhat different implication, but nonetheless, one of the principles of the Torah, and we read it, Al pi Torah asher yerucha v'al hamishpat asher yomru lecha ta'aseh. In other words, we are obligated to listen to the Chachamim. We're obligated to listen to our to the rabbis, and whatever they tell you, that this is how you do it. So what the in theologically speaking, philosophically speaking, God gave the mandate, so to say. God gave the permission to the leaders of every generation to interpret the text and to add or to change, etc. Okay? Now it becomes like later on much more complicated, but that's kind of the principle. So when we say that God has commanded us, it means that God gave the authority to the rabbis, and the rabbis made that decree, that commandment to light the Shabbat candle. Now, to Maxine's remark earlier, turning on the light is derivative. That's the rabbinic understanding. And yes, it's a rabbinic understanding, but that's a derivative of a Torah prohibition of fire. Okay, so the Torah specifically talks about one is not allowed to start a fire, kindle a fire on Shabbat. And the rabbis understood that when electricity came to, when electricity was invented, there was a lot of halachic discussion about it. There's like, books and books and books that were written about that. But the bottom line, to make it simple, it was the rabbinic understanding that it's, to some extent, it not on the technical, so much on the technical level, but conceptually, it is what we call a tolada, a derivative of lighting a candle, a fire. Some suggest it's makebe patish, it's completing an action, but it becomes very, very technical. It really doesn't matter, and this is why they prohibited of turning on and off the lights. We are allowed to use the lights on Shabbat, right? Because this is a similar way to the candle. In other words, I can't light the candle on Shabbat. However, I am not only that, I have a mitzvah, I have an obligation to light Shabbat candles, because why? So I can see. Exactly, so I can see and celebrate Shabbat.
We have Sephardic relative.
Yeah. Okay.
And he was saying that the rabbi in Israel, I don't know how.
Yeah.
Are discussing the fact that the wires are already in the walls.
Correct.
And you're saying it's completing.
It's completing a circuit. That's
there.
yeah. But and as I said before, I'm less concerned about the technicalities, and there's like some rabbi obsessed with all that stuff, like the technicalities, whether it's going to be this one and what kind of prohibition is it, like there's like a whole discussion about LED lights because it's from what I understand it's a little bit different. I don't know much about the technology, but the point is the concept. Okay, now where this is coming from. Okay, so every time we're gonna see something, we're gonna just delve into a little bit of the halacha, the theology, whatever, but also a little bit of the history. Then we're gonna go into the text itself and gonna kind of a salad of everything, give us a better understanding. So the obligation to light the Shabbat candles appear already in the Mishnah. Okay, we're in the bottom of page 305. Okay, it's already in the Mishnah. We see that in Masechet Brachot. And later on, the Talmud in Masechet Brachot expand on that. And the Mishnah and the Talmud do not mention actually a blessing. It's interesting. That's later on in the time of the Geonim, starting from the 6th century or so, like that period somewhere, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th century. Probably this blessing was added. And as we said, that the primary reason why we light the Shabbat candles is to have illumination, to have light. Yeah, to have light for the Friday night meal. It's really not fun to have. I mean, it might be romantic, but not really. And there's an interesting debate among the rabbis, actually, whether the fact that I'm lighting the Shabbat candles is in honor of Shabbat, because it's like it's an important day, it's whatever. It's like, how can you sit in the dark? Or it's practical. It's for practical reasons, so I can see what I'm doing and eating, etc. So that's a discussion, and the kind of a conclusion was that it's both. Interesting concept that also comes from the Talmud. They say that it also promotes peace within the household, shlom bayit. Okay, because you can, like normal people, sit, talk, not bump into each other when it's dark, whatever. It's also shlom bayit. And what I want to do is actually interesting. So we see the benefit of all that stuff, right? To understand. Flip the pages for a couple of pages to no, it's not here. Okay, it's not here. There's another there's another Mishnah that I think we mentioned that in one of the other classes. It talks about the prohibition of reading on Shabbat using the candles, the Shabbat candles. And the Mishnah says Shema Yateh. What is the prohibition? So we're talking about lamps that are made, it's like all olive, right? They have olive oil, olive oil or whatever, any other oil, and there's a wick, right? And this is how. Okay, so there's a discussion, and it says that one is not allowed to use that light in order to read on Shabbat, to learn. Why? Because we are afraid Shema Yateh. What happens when the oil is like sitting there and doesn't reach the wick? You need to kind of tilt. You need to tilt the lamp a little bit, right? So the oil is going to, right? Everybody understand what I'm saying? Okay. Think that you're drinking from a cup with a straw. Okay? And when you get to the bottom and your straw, if your straw is not long enough, it doesn't reach. So what do? You tilt the cup a little bit, right, to where the straw is, and then you can, right? So this is not permissible on Shabbat, not with the water and the straw, but with a lamp, right? With a lamp is because this is violation of the prohibition of fire. What? It's not a stretch. Just the Mishnah discusses that, and the Mishnah says, so because of that, and it's a very natural thing to do. Like, if my wick is my light is gonna start flickering because it's the end of the oil, what I'm going to do, very naturally, I'm gonna take the lamp, I'm gonna tilt it a little bit, so a little bit more oil is going. I'm sorry? It doesn't matter. You're not allowed to do anything with the fire.
Yes.
That's not me. This is the Mishnah. Okay, I understand. We don't use fire. By the way, we'll get into that in a second. You'll see how it becomes also relevant in our days, right? So this is why the Chachamim said in the Mishnah, Shema Yateh, don't read by the light because we are afraid that you're going to do that. And there's a story about one of the rabbis that actually caught himself for the last minute, and he says like, oh, it's, so now I appreciate the why the Chachamim made that ruling, because I almost did that. Okay. Now, if you think that it has no implications today, you're wrong. First of all, so we have how you call it? Fireplace. Thank you. And it's cute for the kids. They like it, whatever. So we have a fireplace, and like in the winter, sometimes before Shabbat, I'll put, okay. So I do it before. No, by the time I come back from shul and we have dinner, and it's like, then it's over. The fire is, and the kids go to, by the time I go to bed, it's finished. Anyway, I don't put like, huge amounts of log. It's fun for the kids, whatever. So you got to be very careful, because you can't play with the fire. It's like, sometimes you want to, stab it, whatever. That's called lachtot bagechalim. That's what the Mishnah is talking about. You're not allowed to do that stuff on Shabbat. So if you start a fire before Shabbat, you leave it, By the way, let's get it even more practical. The hot plate. Yeah, you on the blech, whatever, you use like a hot plate for Shabbat, right? Or a crock pot for your cholent or whatever, all that kind of stuff. Some of the laws that are restricting our practice on Shabbat are derived from that. Here is an example. We can't use the fire, right? So what is the hot plate? It's technically fire, but no knobs, no nothing. I can't play with that. I can't change the temperature. I can't. Okay, this is because that is like if I am playing with the coals in the fire or whatever, or tilting. This is dealing with the fire, helping the fire in some way to benefit me, whether it's reading, whether it's cooking, whether it's all that kind of stuff. Okay. If you make a cholent for Shabbat, for example, so if let's assume that you want to do something with that, like, after Shabbat started, like Shabbat morning, whatever, it needs something, mix it or whatever, and that kind of stuff. Can you do that? Well, it depends. It depends what was the state of the cholent before Shabbat.
It was fully cooked before.
All right, not fully. At least third. Kemachal ben dulsai. Edible. That's what it means. If it was already edible, not fully cooked even, you can play with that. Why? Because that action of me mixing that, or adding water or any of that stuff, if it was not cooked before, it's just like those logs in my fire pit, or I can't touch it. I can't do anything with it. However, if it was like a little bit cooked, at least third, that's called ma'achal ben dulsai, then it's cooked. If it's cooked, that means, yes, it continues to cook, but it was already ready before Shabbat, at least edible before Shabbat. I can play with that. Okay, so there's a lot of implications that have to do with fire, or whatever we consider halachically fire, that are derived from this idea of how we use fire. Okay, so I know we expanded a lot. It was only the blessing on the candles, but I think we're going to cover a lot of stuff in Judaism, because looking at the tefillot themselves. So we have a commandment to ladlik ner Shabbat, to fulfill this mitzvah of lighting the candle of Shabbat. We spoke about the benefits, and interestingly, this is the mitzvah that specifically was given to women. Okay, so what somebody is, his wife is away. She went on vacation with her girlfriends. Okay, of course, the man's supposed to light the candles. Of course, you got to have the candles in the house where you're staying. Okay, Shabbat candles. So if the woman is not around, and the husband is doing it or whatever, okay? When I lived alone, as a student in New York, whatever, that's what I did. I lighted the candles every Shabbat.
As a single.
The rabbis in the Talmud already. Actually, in the Mishnah even, before the Talmud.
It's not just the man.
No. Single men, yeah.
It's for people. It's constantly having
light in the house. Okay. And with this blessing, with this action, you go like this, and and you make the bracha. All that stuff is what is accepting Shabbat. Usually, yeah, there are some unusual cases, but generally speaking, when you light the candles, this is when you accept Shabbat. It's Shabbat for you. That's it. Once you turn you light the candles, you don't turn on the TV, right? You don't do whatever, right? That's generally speaking. What about the men? How they accept Shabbat? Well, I don't light the candles. My wife does.
But are you watching the same?
Usually I'm not. I'm already in trouble when she lights the candles. Okay, Kiddush is not really accepting Shabbat. Kiddush happens when I come back from shul already, right? So it's Shabbat already started before. Okay, that's going to be connected to what we're going to learn today. It's part of Kabbalat Shabbat. It's the recitation of Psalm 92 as part of Kabbalat Shabbat. This is when the man accepts Shabbat. Of course, whether you accept it or not accept it, whether you light the candles or not, whether you recite Psalm 92 or not, once Shabbat starts, it starts, okay? So whether you like it or not, it's going to be Shabbat. Okay? Okay. Now, let's turn the page. We're going to page 309. So let's talk about this poem for a second. So this is Yedid Nefesh. Many congregations have the custom of reciting Yedid Nefesh, that poem, prior to Kabbalat Shabbat. We're going to talk about Kabbalat Shabbat today. And it's an interesting one. We're going to talk about Kabbalat Shabbat in a second. But this poem is also from the same era as Kabbalah, when Kabbalat Shabbat, that service was originated. That means this also from the 16th century, was written in Israel, 16th century, by Rabbi Elazar Azkari, or Azikri, depends on how you spell it, doesn't matter. Okay? He lived in Tzfat, 1533 to 1600. Prominent figure among the Kabbalists of Tzfat. We're going to talk about the Kabbalists of Tzfat in a second. Cordovero, and of course the Arik was the head of the group. And the poem is structured in 4 stanzas, as you can see, right? As you can see here in the Siddur, is very clear. There's 4 stanzas, and each stanza comprising 3 lines. I like it like in the Koran, they did that very clearly. And each line is divided into 2 sides. Or we call it like 2 tzlaot, actually, in when you analyze poems. Okay. Now, the lines follow an AABBAA rhyme scheme. So you'll see. Yedid Nefesh, Abba Rachaman, Meshoch Avdach El Retzonach, Yarutz Avdach Kemo Ayal, Ishtachave Mul Hadarach. And then we have, so the first 2 lines of each stanza ending with the sound ach, right? Retzonach, Hadarach, Ahavatach, Zivach, Ohavach, Uzach, Shelomach, Bach, right? It all rhyme. And then the 3rd line is the sound, or actually ta'am, olam, tit'alam, olam, okay? So it's very, very clear structure of a poem. Now, if you look at the very beginning of each stanza, there's acrostic of Yud Hey Vav Hey, which is God's name. Right, the first letter, Yud Hey Vav Hey. Everybody see that? Okay. So I'm giving you a lot of techniques, a lot of stuff to look, because we're going to deal with a lot of poems and there's going to be a lot of that stuff. Okay. Now, so I said it was composed by Rabbi Elazar Azikri, or Azkari, in Tzfat. We started to see that in Sidurim, in the Sephardic tradition specifically. And only like, I don't know, 70, 80, maybe even 100 years later, we start to see that in Ashkenazi Sidurim as well. The first to include that, the first Ashkenazi one, was the Yavetz. We're going to talk about Sidur Yavetz is a very, very important. That's the Yavetz was of Yaakov Emden, major rabbi in Europe and scholar in the 1700s. And he wrote a Sidur called Beit Yaakov. And this is the first time that we see that in Ashkenazi Sidur. And he described it as this poem as a song to awaken the soul to the love of the blessed name. That's my translation. Okay. And this is a poem. I think many congregations have the practice of singing that poem before Shabbat, on Kabbalat Shabbat. It's actually interesting. In the Sephardic tradition, they do that before Mincha. And the Ashkenazi tradition, they do it after Mincha, before Kabbalat Shabbat. It's an interesting... many congregations, also, many places, many people do that also as part of Suda Shlishit, the third meal in Shabbat afternoon. Singing also Yedid Nefesh. What?
No.
As part of Zmirot, yeah. But specifically for the Suda Shlishit. Okay, if you turn the page, we start with Kabbalat Shabbat. Page 311. So Kabbalat Shabbat, so the Shabbat services, let's call it this way, starts with this, on Friday evening, obviously, started with a short service called Kabbalat Shabbat, which means what? Welcoming or receiving the Shabbat. Okay, it's a prelude for the Shabbat services, and that service is the youngest of the services that we have in our liturgy. It was composed by the 16th century Kabbalists in Tzfat, right, in the northern part of Israel, in the city of Tzfat, which was the center of Jewish mysticism at the time. And what we're going to see in the Kabbalat Shabbat service is the following. Kabbalat service, Shabbat service consists of Psalm 95 to 99. Then it's Psalm 29. Then depends on the tradition, but here in this Siddur, we're going to see two poems. One is called Ana Bechoach, and then Lecha Dodi. And then we have Psalm 92 and 93. And then we're going to see a Mourner's Kaddish that separate that part of the service from what happens later. So, what happens later? Let's start with an overview before the breakdown, overview of what happens in the shul on Friday night. So, like every day, and we spoke about that last week, every day there's a Mariv service. Right? There's an evening service. The evening service is based on the fact that what? The extras, the fats, the chalavim, the shuman used to be burned on the altar throughout the night. Right? Because there was no sacrifice at night. There was a sacrifice in the morning, the Tamid Shel Shachar. There was another sacrifice, the Tamid of the Ben Arbaim, the afternoon sacrifice. That is paralleled by the Shacharit and the Mincha services. However, just a little recap from last week. The Mariv service is kind of reverberates the burning of the leftovers on the altar throughout the night. Okay, that's basically kind of oversimplifying it. So, like every day of the week, we have a Mariv service also on Friday night. Now, prior to that, we have, as I just told you, Kabbalat Shabbat. On Friday night, we have Kabbalat Shabbat. It's a prelude for the Shabbat. And in order to separate, so it's clear, this is Kabbalat Shabbat, and this is the Mariv service, we have a couple of buffer zones. Okay? One of them, which is very, very popular, is when the rabbi speaks. Many shuls have the tradition that the rabbi speaks between the two parts of the evening. Similarly, in the morning, by the way, the sermon is also separating that part of the service from the Musaf service that we're going into. So this is why many rabbis speak at that point just before Musaf. So that's one buffer zone. Okay, but having rabbis speaking is relatively is a modern thing. In the old days, the only time that there were two sermons in the year. That's it. One was Shabbat HaGadol, the Shabbos before Pesach, where the rabbi spoke about the laws of Pesach. And the other one was Shabbat Shuvah. And the rabbi spoke before Yom Kippur. That's it. Finished. Now rabbis are required to speak every day. But back then, Some people would like that, by the way, going back to 2 sermons a year. Okay. Now, I want to jump into Kaddish for a second, just because I mentioned that the last piece of the Kabbalat Shabbat is a Kaddish. In this particular case, it's a mourner's Kaddish. We're going to talk about the mourner's Kaddish a lot, but not today. Kaddish functions, we're going to talk about Kaddish when we come to that, don't worry. But Kaddish function, one of the functionalities of the Kaddish, when we see it in the service, is to separate the different units of tefillah. Okay, we spoke about that last week. We said that there is a structure of tefillah, right? We go with different units. We have the morning blessings, then we have the sacrifices, then we have Sukkei de Zimra, then we have the Shema and its blessings, then we have the Amidah, right? So to separate whatever needed, not always, we have a Kaddish, right? So we have a Kaddish before the Shema, after Psukei de Zimra. It's a half Kaddish. Usually it's a half Kaddish. Sometimes we use a different Kaddish. We'll get to that. Okay? So here, another buffer or another something that tells us Kabbalat Shabbat is over. The next thing is going to be Mariv, is a Kaddish there. And in that particular case on Friday night, it's a mourner's Kaddish. Why specifically a mourner's Kaddish? Because the practice is that after recitation of Tehillim, after recitation of Psalms, usually the practice is to have the mourner's Kaddish rather than the half Kaddish. Yes?
Okay, and trying to picture with, you're identifying Kaddish as a process in between different sections of the tefillah. There's one right before Arik. So
that's the full Kaddish.
Yeah, but so what's the deal with that?
The full Kaddish always relates to the Amidah, except for one case, which is Slichot. Okay, we'll deal with that when we come to that. So the full Kaddish always relates to the Amidah. So you understand that everything that happens until that Kaddish is kind of an extension of the Amidah. Tachanun and all that kind of stuff is. Okay? So it separates that Amidah unit from the concluding part of the service. Okay, back to our thing. We're now in Kabbalat Shabbat. So I said we have 6 Psalms. 95, 96, 97, 98, 99, and 29. What is 6? Think about it as you, exactly, 6 days of the week. So those Psalms representing the days of the week. This is why we have 6. Specifically, Psalm 29 is associated with Friday. But before jumping into that stuff, let's talk about the roots for that. Because people didn't come in the 16th century, those Kabbalists in Tzfat, and said, hey, let's make up something. Okay? It doesn't work like that. There's got to be some origin. There's got to be like something where it comes from. Okay? So the roots of Kabbalat Shabbat are traced back in the Talmud. If you look at Masechet Shabbat, Tractate Shabbat, page 119a, you'll see the following, that there's statements over there by the rabbis saying that on Friday, at the time of Shabbat or prior to Shabbat, like around the time of sundown, etc., they used to go out to the fields and say, come bride, Shabbat the bride. Okay? And this allegory of Shabbat is the bride and Am Yisrael is the groom is something that we see all throughout the liturgy of Shabbat. We're going to see it a lot. Okay? Fine. And by the way, that concept is the inspiration for another practice, less among Ashkenazi shuls, more Sephardic tradition, is to read on Friday evening Song of Songs, because that's a love story. And if we are going to talk about this relationship between Am Yisrael and the Shabbat, and we compare it to a groom and a bride, then we understand the connection to read a love story. Okay? Okay. So now, when we look at the Kabbalat, we have to look at that backwards, like many other things in Judaism. We have to, in order to understand what's going on over there and how we ended up with this, we have to look backwards. Okay? So have in mind just the structure for a second. We have the 6 Psalms, you have a poem, and then you have 2 more Psalms. Okay? So far, so good? Now, the 2 Psalms at the end, that's Psalms 92 and 93. Now, 92 and 93, they always go together. They always go together. What is Psalm 92? Well, that makes sense that we're going to read it there because it says, Mizmor Shir Leyom HaShabbat, a psalm, a song for the Sabbath day. That is the psalm that is associated with Shabbat. Okay, that's a no-brainer. You understand why this is happening. Now, so, what happened? Now a little bit of a history. As you know, there was a community that stayed in Israel after the destruction of the temple. You know, that's the beginning of the Jerusalem Talmud, etc., all that kind of stuff, right? So the ancient Israeli custom was, which stems from that practice that we see already in the Talmud, is to recite Psalms 92 and 93 before Shabbat as a kind of a preparation for Shabbat. This is where it starts from. Okay, so we have level 1, statement from the Talmud saying that some rabbis used to go out to the fields and say, "Come, bride, Shabbat, the bride." Okay, fine, beautiful. Second layer. In Israel, they said, look, just came back from work, you know, rushing, shower, everybody's like, whatever. It's like, what? I'm going to jump right into the Mariv. It's as we say, you know, sepasnisht, you know, you need like a little bit of to calm down. You need to kind of like prepare yourself to welcome Shabbat. It's a special day. What do? How do we kind of prepare ourselves for tefillah? It's recitation of Tehillim, of Psalms. We do it every day. That's Sukkot Zimra. That Psalms that we have in the beginning of the Shacharit service every day. That's a preparation for us to get us ready to be able to recite the Shema, to do the Amidah, all that kind of stuff. So it's an ancient practice to use Psalms, to recite Psalms as an inspiration for tefillah. Okay? This is why we have so much Psalms in our tefillot, because they were already incorporated, built into our tefillot. Okay? So they said, okay, it's Shabbat. What psalm we're going to recite as a preparation? Mizmor Shir Leyom HaShabbat, a psalm for the Sabbath day. Perfect. Great. So that's level 2. Fine. Then we come to the Kabbalists in Tzfat. Okay, we're making a little bit of a jump to the 16th century. And tradition attributes the formation of this service to the Arik, Rabbi Yitzchak ben Shlomo Luria Ashkenazi. Right? He was born in 1534, died in 1572. And he was kind of the leader of that group. known as the Arik, right? But with him, that was a group of people, other rabbis, Rabbi Moshe ben Yaakov Cordovero, that was his, by the way, his brother-in-law, and Rabbi Shlomo Alevi Alkavetz, the guy that wrote the Lecha Dodi. We're going to see that in a couple of minutes. And according to the tradition, it is the Ari that instituted. It was his own practice, and his students saw, oh, that's what he's doing, we're going to adopt that. And then their students, oh, that makes sense, we're going to do that as well. And it became like the practice. So he started with reciting Psalm 29 as well. So in addition to Psalm 92 and 93, he said, you know what? It makes sense to recite also Psalm 29. Fine. Okay. And then Cordovero, his brother-in-law, said, you know what? That represents actually, in our understanding of Kabbalah and Kabbalistic ideas, as Friday, representing Friday. What about the rest of the week? So let's add Psalms 95 to 99 as representing Sunday through Thursday. And here we go. All of a sudden, we understand how this entire service was made up. Then another guy from that group, Rabbi Shlomo Alevi Alkavetz, wrote a poem. It's called Lecha Dodi. And we already find that Lecha Dodi incorporated into a prayer book that was written in 1599. So it didn't take a lot of time. Okay? So we have Psalms 95 to 99. So again, the first layer, the rabbis go out to the field, say, come Shabbat the bride. Second layer, the Ari comes. It's the ancient Israeli custom to recite Psalm 92, 93. Then the Ari comes and he said, you know what? We're going to add Psalm 29. Then his brother-in-law, Rabbi Moshe Cordovero, says, you know what? We're going to add Psalms 95 to 99. Then their students, Rabbi Alkavetz, says, you know what? I'm going to write a poem, and that's going to be there as well. Boom. Here's the entire Kabbalat Shabbat service. Okay. So it became very popular very quickly. And all the communities all around the world adopted that. Not everywhere, though. I have to be honest. Like in Germany, for example, what we call Ashkenaz, and in the Germany, France, that area, it took a while. It penetrated much later. Also, what we call the Yerushalmi community. Okay, the Sfarim, what do we call the Samachtet, the Sfaradi Tahor, they call themselves, like Yoram Gaon, those people that were originally from Spain and went from Spain to Yerushalayim when the Jews were kicked out in 1592 from Spain. They went directly to Eretz Israel, and they stayed in Yerushalayim for many, many, many generations. They already arrived in Yerushalayim around the same time that the Kabbalists were in Tzfat in the 1600s. And they didn't accept that minhag so quickly. Some of them yes, some of them no. But there is a minhag, there's a custom, there's a practice in some of the Yerushalmi communities to start only from Psalm 29. Because that preceded when they came. But the other stuff, no. Last summer, it was, for me at least, it was the first time that I was in a shul that followed that tradition. And I expect, I come to shul and I expect, I knew it's a Sephardic shul, but we were a family simcha, and I was I expect Kabbalat Shabbat. And the Chazan starts me as well. from Psalm 29. I said, whoa, this is cool. I don't know if it's cool, but for me, it was cool because I never experienced that. Anyway, it exists. Now, what does it mean that it's a new service and all that kind of stuff? You're going to tell me, okay, who cares? It's in the Siddur. We come to Shul, we say it. What do you want from me? Who cares? All the history and all that kind of stuff. Who cares? What's the point? Because it has a lower halachic status, because it came late in the game. So the couple of practices. So for example, a lot of communities deliberately, the Chazan will lead Kabbalat Shabbat from a different place, not where the regular place where the Chazan stands, but from a different place, just to show that it's not the same level of obligation. Just one practice. Another practice, you don't need a minyan for that. You can do it even without a minyan. Another implication, you don't need to be a bar mitzvah in order to lead that. And actually, for many years, I did that here. I had kids leading Kabbalat Shabbat, specifically kids under bar mitzvah doing that. Okay? Because there's no Kaddish, there's no Baruch, there's no Kedusha, there's none of that stuff that requires minyan and requires adults. Okay? We're going to talk about the concept, it's called Dvarim Shebi Kedusha. Okay? So these are some of the implications of that stuff. And without the historic background, it's hard to understand why this is, why we do that. Now, let's take a look at that poem. Actually, before that poem, there's, if you look at page 319, at the very top, there's another poem, right? Ana bechoach gdulati mincha tatir tzerura. Yeah, very top of 319. It's a seven line poem. Each line has 6 words, at least supposed to be. And if you take all the beginnings, all the first letters, you'll see this. It's supposed to be like a mystical 42-letter name of God. I don't know, whatever. I'm not so sure. I'm not a big expert on Kabbalah and that kind of mystical stuff. And it is attributed to Rabbi Nechunya ben Hakana. Okay, at least some believe. Okay, the more mystical Hasidim, whatever. That's Rabbi Nechunya ben Hakana lived in the 1st century, in the beginning of 2nd century in Israel. Modern scholars actually disagree, and they say that no, it's impossible, and it was written probably in the Middle Ages. It's not really for us to make a decision here. Okay, and again, it's Kabbalistic influences, so you're going to see it in Sephardic Sidurim, you're going to see it definitely in what we call Hasidic Nusach Sfard Sidurim, but a lot of the Ashkenaz Sidurim include that as well. As you know, when Jews were in Europe, they were going back and forth, and a lot of the what we call the East Juden, right? The Jews who lived in Poland and Russia ended up in Germany, also because conditions were a little bit better there in the 1700s or so, and so they brought those influences there, etc. There was a lot of migration, so you see that. But in Nusach Ashkenaz, what we call the original Nusach Ashkenaz, the German, real, pure Nusach, it's not there. Nobody uses that nusach, I think, anymore, except for me, but that's a different story. Okay, which brings us to Lecha Dodi. Lecha Dodi, as I mentioned, was written by Elkabetz. And how do I know that? Look at the acronym. Look at the first letter of each stanza. So we have Shin, Lamed, Mem, Hey, that is Shlomo. And then we have Hey, Lamed, Vav, Yud, that's Halevi. Shlomo Halevi. And who was Shlomo Halevi? That's Shlomo Halevi Elkabetz. Okay? So we see that, and that was very, very popular style of writing at that time. We see it tremendous, like, all over in the poems, in the high holiday liturgy and that kind of stuff. Okay? It's something that was a stylistic thing, with their name. Okay, it was kind of a signature. Now, look at the kind of the refrain. Come, my beloved, to greet the bride. Let us welcome the Shabbat. And that's the ending of each stanza. Well, this is the line from the Talmud that those rabbis, remember the first tier of Kabbalat Shabbat? The rabbis go and say, welcome to come Shabbat the bride, come Shabbat. This is it. So what he did, he took that original line from the Talmud and he wrote a poem around that. Now the poem itself, we can look further and further detail into that. But the idea here, the style of those early poems was a quotes of psukim, but it's not complete psukim. Okay, let's take just like one example. I need to finish at 12, which is not going to happen already. It's 11:59 because I have a quick rehearsal for the lunch. But I just want to look at the first stanza for a second. Shamor v'zachor. What is Shamor and what is Zachor? Right. So we have two, right? As you know, in the Torah, we have twice mentioning of the 10 Commandments. One time in Sefer Shmot, in the book of Exodus, the Torah uses the word Shamor, observe the Shabbat. And then on Sefer Dvarim, Deuteronomy, we have Zachor et Yom HaShabbat. Remember the Shabbat day. So what does he say? Shamor v'Zachor, he's referring to the two times of that commandment, of the two mentioning of the 10 commandments, Shabbat specifically, B'dibur echad, in one act of speech. Because at the end of the day, yes, we have two times that the 10 commandments are mentioned in the Torah, but it's the same 10 commandments. Okay, we call it Aseret HaDibrot in Hebrew. What dibrot? So that's plural. What is the singular? Diber, dibra, or dibur, the way he put it. Okay, fine. Hishmianu el hamiyuchad, who, okay, Hishmianu, from the word lishmoa, to hear, right? Hishmianu, he caused us to hear, to listen. Who? El hamiyuchad, the special God. I mean, that special God made us hear, made us listen to that commandment of Shabbat twice, or in those two mentioning of it. Hashem echad u'shmo echad. Okay, we're familiar with that line, right? That's the very famous pasuk from the book of Zechariah. Vayom mahu, yeh Hashem echad u'shmo. Right? Okay, so this is where it comes. Hashem echad u'shmo echad. L'shem ultiferet ve'lithila. Okay, for how do he translate? For renown, for splendor, and for praise. Because what do you do with God's name that is one? For what purpose? So others, right? All the nations will know that Shem Tiferet Tehillah, splendor and then we have the refrain Lecha Dodi Likrat Kala Pnei Shabbat Nekabbalat. Okay, so this is like the first one. Maybe we'll go into the other stanzas, maybe not. We'll see, but we'll continue next week. Okay, so next week, same time, same place. As far as I know.